Okay, so I'm gonna do a reply to Reward Audacity when he we're talking back and forth about the land thing. The first thing that you had kind of mentioned was looking at some off-grid land with seasonal access. Uh, Now I could do. I might have done a video on versus off grid, but I might have took it down. But I might redo that because there's a lot of different stuff that I talked about in there. Or maybe I made it and I didn't even post it. I do that sometimes. But there's certainly some pros and cons to on versus off grid and access. There's definitely price differences. There's certain equipment needed. There's different options that a person has available to them. Different levels of privacy. So I could probably do an entire video on just that. The the next thing was the land size. Now this is one of those things where a person, I don't know, like I've come across this myself looking at land and looking at how much land is needed versus wanted. And there's a lot of different options. Like to me, I've always liked the idea of like five or 10 acres or more being better, right? But there's once again there's advantages and disadvantages to that. And even if you don't get the amount of land that you want, is the idea of moonshine car, tanker car, blocker car, whatever, is that really dead? I would say no. I mean, the option is still a person can build these things, but I get it if you then you're like, well, I want to race it, and I don't know. The other thing too, and this could be a revenue stream, is cooking, making home brew. And I won't get too far into that because certain people don't like getting their cut of certain things. So we'll just leave it at that. Then you mentioned one of the first buildings to go up would be a Quonset. At least that's what I think. You mentioned a steel building. Now, in my mind, I look at a Quonset because, like, especially coming from growing up in an agricultural background, they were pretty common. Guys would use them as a cheap means to build a really big shop. Although they're difficult to insulate because they're rounded. But I mean, what they're really meant for was storing grain. But like I say, I mean, they definitely work as a shop. They just, like I say, when it comes to, they have advantages in the sense where you'd mentioned like pulling a camper in there, and that would be fantastic because you've got you're pulling it into an area that is out of the wind. You've got some kind of dead air space around it. Makes it a lot easier to heat that camper. And also, too, I've seen online. I'm not sub to him, but he's got his own channel there. It's the Idahoan show. Yeah, he built a Quonset, and he does like a lot of machining and stuff like that. And he actually built like framed like a little building inside of his Quonset, but then you don't really have to finish it the same way, so there is that advantage to it. You had also mentioned the sawmill building, and I could almost have a whole discussion on this, but it depends on what kind of what kind of sawmill you're looking at. Are you looking at one run by a power like a chainsaw? Are you looking at one that's um, you know a one that has like an actual circular saw? Are you looking at one that has a band saw? And depending on how you plan on harvesting your wood, what kind of wood you're using, all that kind of stuff is going to really depend on what is going to be best for your purposes. The circular saw is is probably the most wasteful, but probably the most versatile. But there are some maintenance issues that come along with that, having to be able to uh, peen the blade and all that kind of stuff. But that it's doable. Um, the Then you'd mentioned the making a stone yurt, and I think that's a good idea. I mean, you ultimately have to do you, but there's certainly some advantages to having something that's like an octagon shape, because along with having stone walls, which are very resilient, you have a lot of angles, so things could glance off, bad things that could hurt a person, if and you know what I mean. Um, the other thing that you had mentioned, or when you were mentioning about building this stone yurt, uh, it made me automatically think, and I don't know why this made me think of it. Jackie Gleason built a house in Florida. Now he built it to look like a flying saucer kind of, um, but it had that, you know, not octagon. It was circular, and it had like kind of like a little like a second story on the top, which looked like it would be good for observation. So I mean, look at that maybe if you're interested, because you could modify it a little bit to do what you want. Then you'd mentioned the size of the house. Now the size of the house, this makes me think like the issue is how big of a house do you want to heat in the wintertime? Um, that's always a balancing act there. You also you also have the use of, if you have a heated area in your shop, you also have that where you could do smaller projects, or rather that's slot car racing, or working on cars, or fabricating stuff, or whatever, right? Whatever you want to do. Maybe you're, I don't know, making birdhouses or glass blowing to sell online or whatever. Doesn't matter, right? But it's something. The other option is you were talking about things to do in the wintertime. Now, being out where you are there, um, you might do a certain amount of wood cutting in the wintertime. Maybe not a lot of it, because wintertime presents the problem of it's harder to get into these areas. But like if you wanted to, you could go out with your ATV, um, in certain areas, and clean up some smaller stuff, right? Just as kind of managing your uh, your lot kind of thing. Also, too, because you've got a background with running heavy equipment, um, you know, a person could always get into doing some snow removal in the wintertime as a sideline. And I get it, you're not really looking for work, but it could be like one of those things that kind of keeps a person busy in the wintertime and gives you a little bit of walking around money. But I mean, ultimately, you got to do what you think is right on that. Um, The summer kitchen is another one that I could probably do an entire video dedicated to. But suffice it to say that that 1919 whatever model cook stove is going to be super handy for you when you get that piece of property. Like I say, I one of the things is like I like the idea of having an area to butcher into, just because then you don't have to bring it into the house and all that kind of stuff, and depending on how closed in or not you make your summer kitchen, like the sky's the limit. Um, Now you had mentioned the use of the summer kitchen for like a defensive position. This is kind of where I was when I was talking about that elevated hunting blind. I think that that could be used for that purpose too, um, as kind of a defensive position. Uh, that's why I kind of said, like, if you could stay in there for prolonged periods of time because you set it up that way, it's got some advantages, and it could be kind of a kind of almost like a forward observation post, um, and you could potentially armor it in some way. I don't know the how practical that is. But I mean, a person can always, you could build it on a steel frame so somebody couldn't burn you out, and maybe whatever, right? Like there's a lot of different options a person could do with that, right? But just a thought. You also mentioned about telescopes. Now I don't know a whole lot when it comes to telescopes. However, I seem to remember years ago you doing some videos where you were shooting and you had spotting scopes. Now, one thing that would be handy, rather that's, you know, seeing a fire or that might be coming your way, or maybe even somebody that would want to harm you and your kitty. Um, Taking one of those spotting scopes, and this is not my idea. I got an uncle who he hunts elk down in Colorado, and he mounts his spotting scope, and he does everything off horseback. Um, and he mounts his spotting scope to a rifle stock. Now, when you got pack animals and that's easy to carry around, but just to take around on your property, having that, I don't know, whatever 15 power spotting scope or whatever mounted to a rifle stock, um, that you could kind of, you got, a couple points of contact, and maybe you could rest against a fence post or a tree or something, or if you had like a shooting stick with you, that could be handy. Or even having a bipod on that stock and having that spotting scope mounted to it. Like there's a lot of different options you could do there, but you know, it's an idea. You'd mentioned there the building inspectors, which that's a pain in the ass no matter where you are. And then you'd also mention the plow truck, which that's going to be a good score for you. It's going to be handy. And it depends on what the size is, right? I don't know if it's a half ton or a 3 ton or whatever size it is. I don't know. But you're going to be able to get a lot done with having an extra vehicle on the property. And I wanted to ask this question: is Ford still a good route to go? Like with all they put all this electronics in them. Like they seem to be really pushing the electronic stuff, which I'm not big into. Um, but yeah. Anyway, I'm almost hitting that 15-minute mark, and I'm pretty sure that's as long as I can go. If I'm wrong on that, let me know. Okay, take care.